The sky hung low that morning, a pale sheet stretched thin over the town of Duskwater, where the dust never settled and the wind smelled like rusted iron and distant loss. People gathered like they always did on auction days, pressed shoulder to shoulder along the fence of the old yard behind the tannery. Boots scuffed earth packed hard by years of watching, bidding, forgetting. Men spoke low, voices rough as sandpaper, smoke curling from their lips like secrets. The widower stood at the edge of it all, just outside the cluster of voices. He was 30, though his eyes had long since crossed into older terrain. His coat was worn, sleeves frayed where he'd pulled them against sorrow. A battered hat shadowed his face, but not enough to hide the hollowness carved there. The land had taken his wife and nearly taken his will. Winter came cruel the year she died, and the fire in his cabin hadn't burned warm since. He didn't come looking for a child. He came because the silence in his home had grown louder than any wind. They brought the girl out third. She was small, narrow as a rail fence, with hair like coal-dusted straw and a mouth set in a straight, quiet line. 11, they said, though she stood like someone older, like someone who'd learned not to flinch. Her dress had once been blue. Now it was mud-stained, too short, a torn hem brushing bruised knees. They hadn't cleaned her proper. That much was clear. Maybe they thought no one would notice. Maybe they knew no one would care. The man beside her, a trader with skin like dry bark and eyes that gleamed like coin, yanked her forward by a rope tied to her wrist. Good for laundry, feed in hogs, or scrub in pans, he called, voice sharp as tin. She don't talk back, neither. No one bid. Not yet. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the ground, where a moth limped in circles on the sun-baked clay, one wing torn. Her lips parted just enough to draw breath, but no sound came. And then, just for a moment, she looked up. Her gaze swept the crowd like smoke. It didn't plead. It didn't beg. It simply held. And that's when the widower saw her. He didn't see a child. He saw a shadow of himself, bone-tired, bracing for the next blow, hoping no one noticed how much it hurt. His jaw tightened. He didn't step forward. Didn't raise his hand. But somehow, some quiet part of him whispered, her. The trader was growing impatient. 10 cents. Just 10. Someone take her off my hands. A few men muttered. One shook his head and spat. Too small. Skin and bone. Not worth the feed. Still, the widower didn't move. He felt the coins in his coat pocket, the ones he'd planned to use for flour and nails. His wife's locket was still tucked beside them, though he hadn't opened it in months. Something in his chest cracked, a low shift of earth. He stepped forward. I'll take her. The words came plain. Not loud. But final. The trader squinted, half suspicious. You got coin? The widower held out a silver piece, the last one with a clear face on it. It gleamed dull in the dust-heavy air. The man grunted and shoved the girl forward. She's yours. Just like that. No paper. No blessing. No name exchanged. She stumbled toward him, wrist still bound, and paused at his boots. He knelt and untied the rope without a word, then stood, turning back toward his wagon parked under the brittle shade of a dying elm. She climbed into the back without being asked. They left the crowd behind, heading west down the trail that led past fields of dying wheat and barns held together by prayers. Neither spoke. The horses moved at a slow clip, the kind that matched the tired rhythm of a life patched with loss. The sun began to dip low, turning the sky a color caught between blood and rose. He hadn't asked her name. She hadn't offered it. By the time the wagon reached the rise just before the canyon split, the wind had picked up. It tugged at her hair, pulled strands loose to dance across her face. She sat with her knees drawn close, elbows resting on them like she'd done it 1,000 times before. The widower glanced at her in the rear view of his mind, quiet, unreadable, but alert. Then she moved. She leaned forward suddenly, eyes locked on something just off the road. Stop, she said, so soft it nearly vanished into the wind. He reined in the horses. What is it? She didn't answer. Just leapt down from the wagon and ran toward the fence line, where wire tangled and twisted like broken promises. He followed, slower, puzzled. That's when he saw the foal. A young one. Chestnut hide, legs like reeds, neck bleeding from where it had gotten itself caught in barbed wire. It was thrashing weakly, eyes wide with panic. Before he could shout, she was beside it, her hand steady. She murmured, not words, but sounds, soothing, rhythmic. The kind of sound a mother might make to a fevered child. She knelt, moving carefully, and began unlooping the barbs from its throat with nimble fingers. The widower reached her side and knelt. Together, in silence, they freed it. The foal staggered back, bled a little, then bolted toward the scrub, tail flicking. She stood, covered in dust and something else, something quiet and ancient. He looked at her. She didn't smile. Didn't cry. Just watched the horizon. Back in the wagon, he reached under the bench and pulled out an old blanket. Handed it to her without a word. She wrapped herself in it and lay down in the straw. They didn't speak for the rest of the ride. When they reached the cabin, the sun had already slipped behind the ridgeline, painting the world in twilight. The widower opened the door and paused, glancing back. She stood by the steps, blanket trailing, small silhouette against a sky bruised with color. "You hungry?" he asked, finally. She nodded once. Inside, the fire hadn't been lit in days. He struck a match and coaxed flame into life. The light filled the space, cracked wood floors, a pot hung over the hearth, a single chair pulled close to an empty table. 2 beds, though one had gone untouched since snow covered the hills. He ladled her some stew, leftover and thin, but warm. She ate without a sound. When she finished, she placed the spoon gently on the edge of the bowl, then looked up. "My name's Emma," she said. He met her gaze, surprised by the suddenness of it. She didn't ask for his name in return. Just offered hers like an olive branch wrapped in worn cloth. He nodded. "All right, Emma." That was all. Outside, the coyotes called like ghosts through the trees. The night settled in, soft as dust on a porch rail. He didn't know what he'd brought into his life. She didn't know what she'd stepped into. But as the fire cracked low and the stars blinked through the rafters, something settled between them. Not peace, not yet, but the fragile, first shape of it. The kind of stillness that follows after a long storm. The kind of stillness where healing begins. The rooster crowed before dawn, but the girl was already awake. She moved quietly through the barn, her bare feet whispering against the packed earth. A pail in each hand, she slipped past the sleeping mule and stepped into the morning like she belonged to it. The widower watched from the window, arms folded across his chest, the steam from his coffee curling into the air like smoke from a dying fire. He didn't say a word. She'd been there a week. She'd spoken only when needed, always soft, never more than necessary. He hadn't asked her for much, and she didn't ask for anything. It was a fragile rhythm, a quiet pattern that kept them both from toppling into the hole that grief had dug between them. They lived beside each other the way 2 old fence posts did, weathered, splintered, close but never touching. She fed the chickens, dragging the sack that was nearly as tall as she was, and scattered the grain like rain. The birds clucked around her, greedy and ungrateful, but she didn't mind. There was something in the ritual of it that calmed her. Feed, step, feed again. She looked older than her years when she worked. Wiser, somehow. Like she knew the language of labor better than lullabies. He mended the fence out by the northern edge, where the cattle sometimes slipped through. His hands were rougher now than they'd ever been, more callous than skin. Each nail he drove in was another word he didn't know how to say. He didn't think about her much when he worked. Not because she didn't matter, but because she mattered more than he knew how to handle. Inside the cabin, the silence grew comfortable in some places and sharper in others. She swept the floor in wide, slow strokes, careful not to stir the dust too much. She'd rearranged the shelf near the hearth, his books, his wife's sewing tin, an old horseshoe he'd once believed brought luck. He noticed the change but said nothing. She'd placed a wildflower in a cracked mason jar beside the window. It wilted quickly, but she didn't remove it. She slept in the loft, a space once meant for hay and old tools. She didn't seem to mind. She made her bed each morning with tight corners and folded edges, the way someone taught her long ago and hadn't bothered to do since. She didn't ask for a better space. He didn't offer. The distance suited them both, though neither could say why. On the 4th night, the wind howled through the hills and slammed hard against the cabin walls. The door rattled in its frame, and the chimney moaned like something alive. She crept down the ladder after the 3rd crash of thunder, clutching the blanket tight around her shoulders. He was already by the hearth, stoking the fire back to life. She didn't speak. Just sat near the flames and tucked her knees to her chest. He didn't ask why she came down. He didn't need to. The shadows danced around them while the storm painted the world in noise. "You scared?" he asked, finally, his voice low, worn at the edges. She nodded once, almost invisible in the flicker. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under the shift. "You can stay till it passes." She stayed the whole night. By morning, they were strangers still, but something in the air between them had changed. The kind of change that didn't speak its name but left footprints behind. The days blurred forward. She fixed the hinge on the pantry door without asking. He left her a tin cup filled with wild blackberries one evening. She scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood grain showed its scars again. He sharpened her knife when he thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. Once, while clearing the barn loft, she found a red scarf, long and delicate, tucked beneath an old saddlebag. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender. She touched it like it might burn her. Then, slowly, she tied it around her wrist. He saw it at dinner. His hand froze over his spoon, eyes locked on that worn piece of cloth. But he said nothing. Just turned his gaze back to the fire and let the silence stretch. She didn't wear it again. In town, the whispers had started. A few curious eyes lingered longer than they should. Folks wondered why he brought her back. Why a man with no kin and too much grief would want a girl with no papers and eyes full of storms. He ignored them. Emma didn't know. He made sure of it. She'd begun to hum soft little sounds while she scrubbed or swept or hauled water from the well. They weren't songs exactly, more like memory echoes. He recognized one. His wife used to sing it when she hung laundry in the spring. He hadn't heard it in years, and when it came out of Emma's throat, small and sure, he had to step outside into the cold just to breathe. She never hummed again after that. They spoke more now, though not about anything that mattered. He taught her how to twist rope when the old one frayed. She asked him where the stars went during the day. He told her they didn't go anywhere, they just waited for the right kind of dark. One afternoon, he caught her standing in the field, arms raised like she was measuring the sky. He leaned against the porch rail, watching. "What are you doing?" he asked, not unkind. "Seeing how big the world is," she said. He smiled then, the kind that surprised them both. She kept measuring. On the 11th day, she cut her hand on a jagged horseshoe nailed wrong to the stall door. Blood welled quick and bright. She bit her lip, refused to cry. He heard her hiss and came running. When he saw the gash, he grabbed a clean rag and pressed it firm, his hands rough but careful. "You gotta tell me when something like this happens," he muttered, voice tight. "You were busy," she said, eyes down. "Doesn't matter." She looked up then, startled by the edge in his voice. "I'm not your pa," he added, softer now, "but I ain't gonna let you bleed alone." She said nothing, but something in her shifted. He could feel it, the way you feel rain coming before the clouds break. That night, he lit the fire early and made cornbread. He left her the last slice. She tucked it under her pillow and ate it slowly, like it was something sacred. Weeks passed, and they became a shape, not family, not friends, but something stitched from silence and shared labor. They ate together, worked together, endured the slow unraveling of grief together. She grew steadier in her step. He grew quieter in his anger. She would wait for him by the fence at sunset, and he would offer her the reins on the mule for the evening ride. They still didn't speak of before. He didn't ask where she'd come from. She didn't ask who he'd lost. But both carried ghosts in their pockets. One evening, as the sky turned the color of burnt honey, she stood by the back gate watching the trees sway. He came up behind her, arms folded. "You miss where you came from?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I miss being seen." He nodded, like he understood more than she expected. "I see you, Emma." She didn't smile. But her shoulders eased, and her hand reached out, just barely, and brushed against his sleeve. He let it stay there. The fire crackled low that night, and sleep came softer than usual. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and for once, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like home beginning to form. The frost lifted slow that spring, like an old man rising stiff from his chair. The earth stretched and cracked open beneath the thaw, and from it came life that had waited patiently beneath months of ice. Green blades pierced brown ground. Birds returned to their branches. And in the shallow bend behind the cabin, where runoff made the soil soft, wildflowers bloomed for the first time in years. Emma was the first to notice them. She stood barefoot in the damp field, mud between her toes, staring at those tiny defiant bursts of yellow and blue like they were some kind of miracle. She didn't touch them. Not at first. Just stared as though afraid that if she breathed too hard, they might vanish. The widower saw her from the porch. Her hair had grown longer, curling slightly at the ends where it once hung limp and straight. She was taller too. Not by much, but enough that he noticed the hem of her dress didn't quite cover her ankles anymore. She stood with her hands tucked behind her back, swaying slightly as the wind pushed through the grass like whispers through tall church doors. That morning, she brought in a handful of those flowers, careful not to crush them. She placed them in the same mason jar on the sill where the last had wilted. This time, they didn't seem like a decoration. They felt like a declaration. She'd started humming again. Quiet at first, like a voice testing the water after silence. Then more often, around the chickens, near the stove, while folding the linens she insisted on washing every third day. The widower didn't stop her this time. He didn't step out or shut the door. He just let the sound settle into the wood of the house, and it began to feel like the walls were breathing again. She organized the pantry one afternoon while he worked on the fence line. When he came in, he found neat rows of jars labeled in her looping, clumsy handwriting, cornmeal, beans, dried sage. He ran his hand along the edge of the shelf, saying nothing, but when she walked past later, she found a small wooden carving on her pillow, a bird, wings outstretched, no bigger than her palm. He never mentioned it, but she kept it near her bed like it meant more than any word ever could. She began to speak more, though never with waste. Her words were like stones, deliberate, heavy, placed with care. She told him when the chickens stopped laying, when the east trough cracked, when the mule had a limp in his right foreleg. He taught her to mend harnesses and patch canvas. Showed her how to sharpen a blade without thinning the edge. They worked side by side most days, saying little, but the air around them began to feel full instead of hollow. Sometimes, in the cool of evening, she'd sit near the fence and trace shapes in the dirt with a stick. Notes, really. Not sentences. Bits of thought she couldn't say out loud. Too many weeds. Don't like porridge. Mule smells like socks ***. One day, he replied with a line of his own, fixing the porch tomorrow. Wear shoes ***. She didn't erase it. Just smiled, small and quiet, then wrote back, maybe. In town, the whispers shifted. Some still muttered, but others began to nod. The widow at the general store slipped Emma a piece of licorice one morning without a word. The blacksmith tipped his hat when they passed. The girl with no name was becoming someone again, someone claimed, someone real. But kindness always draws shadows. And one afternoon, a preacher from another town rode up in a buggy dressed in black too clean for the road. He spoke gently, all soft concern and careful phrasing. Said he'd heard there was a young girl staying on the farm. Said the law was gray in matters like this. That children needed papers. Orphanage records. Approval. The widower didn't invite him in. He stood on the porch with arms crossed and jaw set. Emma wasn't inside the house. She'd seen the buggy come over the hill and vanished before its wheels found the gate. I'll look into what's needed, the widower said. The preacher nodded, too agreeable. For her sake, of course. When he was gone, the widower didn't speak of it again. But that night, he moved the second bed down from the loft and placed it near the stove. Emma didn't say anything when she saw it. She just stood there for a long moment, hands curled around the edge of her blanket. Then she made the bed carefully, folding the corners like before. At dinner, she whispered, "Thank you." He only nodded, but something in his chest tightened, not painfully, but like a muscle remembering how to move. The next week, Emma painted a tin sign that said welcome and nailed it to the post near the gate. The letters were crooked, and the color ran in streaks, but she smiled when she looked at it. One night, they sat together by the fire. He was carving another bird, smaller this time. She watched, legs curled under her, fingers wrapped around a warm mug of broth. The room smelled like wood smoke and thyme. "Did you mean to buy me?" she asked, not suddenly, but softly. He kept carving, eyes on the wood. "No." She nodded, unsurprised. "Then why?" He set the carving down, rubbed a thumb across his chin. "You looked like someone who shouldn't be left behind." She blinked once, then again. "I was used to it." He looked at her then. Really looked. She held his gaze like it was something warm she hadn't touched in a long time. "You're not anymore," he said. Later that night, after she was asleep, he stepped outside. The moon hung low, casting silver on the roof and fence posts. The wind moved through the grass like fingers through hair. He stood there for a long while, the stars watching. Inside, Emma dreamed of wildflowers and rain that came soft and clean. She'd begun to laugh, now and then. Not often. But sometimes, when the mule made a strange noise, or when a chicken got stuck in the trough, or when he dropped a spoon and it clanged against the stove like a bell in a church without walls. Her laughter wasn't loud. It was like sunlight filtered through cotton. And when he heard it, the widower felt something in him rise, like sap in spring, slow and sure and ready. She found a book in the cellar one morning. It was old and missing half its cover, but she read the first few pages aloud while he chopped wood. Her voice stumbled, uncertain, but steady. He didn't stop her. Just kept splitting logs and letting her words fill the air between the axe and the earth. They built a rhythm from scratch. Chores became choreography. Meals became moments. And though they never said it outright, they became something that resembled kin. One day, while planting the garden, she knelt beside the furrows and dug small holes for carrot seeds. The sun sat high, warming the back of her neck. The widower leaned on his shovel, watching. "You're good at this," he said. She smiled without looking up. "I like things that grow." By the time the first green shoots pushed up from the soil, the dirt beneath their feet felt like something sacred. She'd stopped waiting to be sent away. He'd stopped thinking of the cabin as hollow. And the wildflowers kept growing. They grew along the fence, between the porch steps, in the cracks of the old path leading to the well. They weren't planted. They just came. Like hope, unexpected but persistent. And Emma, in her quiet, deliberate way, watered them every morning. Not because they needed it, but because she did. It was the kind of morning where the wind came down from the ridge hard and fast, carrying the scent of something heavy and unfinished. The clouds weren't dark yet, but they hung too low, thick and humming with the promise of change. Emma stood on the porch, one hand curled around her tin mug, eyes fixed on the horizon like she could read whatever trouble it was bringing. The widower felt it too. Not just in the sky, but in the animals, how the chickens stayed close to the coop, how the mule refused to wander far. Even the barn groaned more than usual, as if every beam was bracing. He watched Emma watching the ridge and said nothing. By midday, the wind had turned mean. Dust curled in tight fists along the trail. Emma stayed inside, her hands busy threading dried corn husks into dolls she never kept. She worked quietly, her brow furrowed, fingers moving with a rhythm too fast for comfort. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the room. They both froze. The widower stood slowly, every step across the wooden floor a drumbeat. He opened the door, and there on the stoop stood a man from another life. A man Emma hadn't seen in nearly a year, but knew down to the stink of his coat and the curve of his sneer. His name was Lyle, though he was never introduced with one. Folks just called him traitor or worse. He wasn't old, but something in him had already gone rotten. His eyes scanned the room, the farm, the girl. "I come to take back what's mine," he said. The widower didn't answer. His hand stayed on the door, body blocking the view inside. "She ain't yours," he said after a moment. Lyle laughed, a sound slick with mockery. "She was sold, clear as day. I never gave up the claim. You paid coin, sure, but not near what she was worth." Emma had stepped behind the hearth, out of sight, her back pressed against the wall. Her breath came shallow. Not afraid of pain, she knew that too well to flinch from it, but afraid of belonging again to someone who saw her as less than a person. The widower stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Lyle sniffed the air, smirking. "Nice setup you've got now. Gotta say, I'm surprised you'd keep her. Most folks wouldn't." The wind tugged at the widower's coat. "You're not taking her." "That so? Law says otherwise. She's got no papers. You didn't register nothing. Just scooped her up like a stray." "She's not a stray. She ain't your blood either." He didn't raise his voice. Didn't draw his fists. But the air around him shifted, still as ice just before the crack. "She's mine in every way that counts." Lyle's mouth twisted. "Then you'll pay for her proper. $50. Cash. Or I ride back to the sheriff and let the law sort it." The widower didn't blink. "You do what you think is right. But she doesn't leave this place." Lyle spat into the dirt, turned, and mounted his horse without another word. The wind swallowed the clatter of his departure. Inside, Emma hadn't moved. When the door opened again, she stared at the widower like he might vanish too. "Will he come back?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "You'll get in trouble." "Maybe." She hesitated, then whispered, "I could run. Go before they find me. Hide until they forget." He walked over slowly and knelt in front of her. His voice came quiet, but anchored in something deep. "You're not running anymore. You hear me?" Her throat worked to swallow. "I don't want to make things worse," she said. "You didn't. But if they make you, if they take me, no one's taking you." She didn't cry. But something behind her eyes broke, like an old door finally giving in to wind. That night, the sky cracked open. Rain came in sheets, lashing the windows, roaring against the roof like the whole world was pounding to be let in. They sat together by the fire, silent but not afraid. The widower watched the flames. Emma sat with her knees to her chest, that little carved bird clutched in one hand. He didn't sleep. By morning, the rain had slowed but didn't stop. The road turned to slick brown syrup, every step a fight against the earth. They rode to town. The general store, the sheriff's office, the small crowd gathered out front to stay out of the mud. All of them had heard. News moved fast when it carried tension. The widower didn't say much. Just walked into the sheriff's place with Emma beside him. Sheriff Barden was a fair man, but fair didn't always mean brave. He leaned on rules the way tired men lean on fence posts, hoping they'd hold. "I don't like this," he muttered, looking from the widower to the girl. "She's not property," the widower said. "Law might not agree. She's family. She's not blood. She's more than blood." Emma stood still, her small hands clenched, head high. She didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just let the silence build around her like armor. The door creaked open. Lyle stepped in, wet coat dripping. "Well," he said with a grin, "you found your backbone, I see." The sheriff held up a hand. "Let's all stay civil." Lyle waved a stained piece of paper. "Legal notice of intent. I can prove she was mine." The widower looked at Emma. Her jaw was locked, shoulders squared. "She's not a thing," he said again. "And I won't let her be treated like one." Barden exhaled. "If this goes to court, it'll get ugly." "Then it gets ugly," the widower said. That's when Martha Lane stepped in. The widow who ran the store. She walked into that office with her apron still on, hair tied back, and a storm in her eyes. "That girl helped my boy when he fell behind the crates last week," she said. Cleaned the wound, calmed him down. No one asked her to. She just did. Then came old Tom from the forge. She fixed my cat's paw when the fool stepped in tar. Wrapped it right. Little thing purred all the way home. Another woman, Mary, from the chapel, added, she brought me soup when I was sick. Knocked and ran before I could thank her. Voices layered, one over the other. She pulled my calf from the creek. She helped my daughter carry firewood. She gave up her biscuits to a beggar boy. Barden rubbed his temples. Lyle sneered. Doesn't make her yours. Martha stepped forward. No, but it makes her one of us. The room went quiet. The sheriff looked between them. Then down at Emma, whose chin trembled but didn't fall. You'll need a proper document, he said finally. Adoption. Signatures. Witnesses. I'll get them, said the widower. Lyle threw his arms up. This is ridiculous. Barden turned, firm now. You sold her. You let her go. And I've seen enough to know she doesn't belong with you. You'll regret this, Lyle hissed. No, the widower said, stepping forward, you will. Lyle left in a storm of curses and spurs, but no one followed. On the ride back, Emma didn't speak. She sat beside him, the road slick and glinting like glass. Rain still fell, gentler now, soft enough to feel like a blessing. He glanced over. You all right? She nodded. Then, quietly, you really meant it? That I'm yours? I don't say what I don't mean. The trees blurred by. The cabin waited ahead, warm and full of breath again. As they crested the ridge and the field stretched out before them, Emma whispered, no one ever picked me before. He took her hand gently, steady and warm. Well, he said, they were fools not to. The storm had passed. But something stronger had taken root in its wake. The year turned, as years do, quietly and without permission. Spring folded into summer, then summer fell into golden dust, the kind that clung to the hem of dresses and made the wheat hum low in the fields. The storms had passed. The papers were signed. And somewhere in all that softness, a girl who once flinched at her own name became someone who answered to it with certainty. Emma belonged now. It wasn't a grand moment, no trumpets or parades. It happened in the steady way things worth keeping do, in the folding of laundry together on the porch, in the way she began to laugh without looking to see if it was allowed, in how she carved her own initials beside his on the barn wall, like it had always been her place to do so. The widower, though people had stopped calling him that as often, carried himself differently too. His shoulders had loosened, his voice no longer a gravel path but something smoother, something warm. He'd grown used to her voice in the mornings, her lists and questions and stubborn refusal to eat biscuits with honey. The silence that used to hang like fog around his home had lifted, replaced with the sound of life lived in full, boots stomping in the mud, laughter from the chicken yard, arguments over the best way to stack firewood. There were hard days still, as there always are. Emma had nightmares sometimes, sweat-soaked and wild-eyed, clutching the little wooden bird until the splinters bit her skin. On those nights, he'd sit beside her with a damp cloth and steady breath, saying nothing, just being there. He never asked what she saw. She never offered. But in the morning, when she found tea already poured and waiting on the table, she understood what love looked like when it came without questions. Harvest came gentle that year. The rains had been kind, the soil deep and forgiving. They worked side by side, loading the wagon with squash and beans, corn husks and root bundles. Emma took to tying bundles with ribbon instead of twine, laughing that food could be beautiful, too. He let her, even if it meant slower work. The townsfolk had changed, too. They no longer stared when Emma walked in. They nodded. They smiled. Mr. Carson, who once mumbled about orphan trouble, now handed her peppermint sticks with a wink. Miss Hattie offered to teach her the violin, though Emma politely declined. Too loud, she'd said, I like things that sit quietly inside. It was during the fall gathering, under a sky lit with lanterns and early stars, that everything settled into place. The townspeople held it every year, music, stew pots, cornbread contests. Emma and the widower came late, having spent the day mending the broken axle on the wagon. She wore a dress Martha Lane had helped her sew. It was plain, cotton and sky blue, but it fit her shoulders just right. Her hair, longer now, was braided down her back, and her boots, second-hand and scuffed, made her feel taller. When they arrived, people didn't stop what they were doing. They didn't hush. They just waved and cleared space at the table. Later, when the fiddle music started, Emma stayed on the sidelines, a cup of cider between her hands. She watched others dance, their boots scuffing up clouds of dust and laughter. The widower stood beside her, arms crossed, gaze soft. Why don't you dance? He asked. I never learned. You don't need much learning. Just someone who won't let go. She looked up at him then, searching his face. It was lined and kind, familiar in every crease. Would you? She asked. I've never been good at it. But you'd try? I already did. She smiled. Then I reckon I will, too. They didn't dance that night, but they walked home close, their steps matching like they'd practiced it all their lives. Weeks passed. The first snow came light and lazy, draping itself over the fields like a quilt. Inside the cabin, warmth pulsed from the hearth, and Emma strung orange slices on twine to dry above the mantel. She whittled now, clumsy, small things, but her hands had steadied, and her eyes narrowed with the same focus he once had. She carved animals mostly. A fox. A bird. A mule with lopsided ears. He kept them all on a shelf above the stove. It was on one such winter morning, when the frost etched silver veins along the windowpanes, that the letter arrived. It came folded neat, pressed with the sheriff's seal. A certificate. A signature. And, scrawled at the bottom in the sheriff's crooked script, "It's done. She's yours, legally and proper." He read it once, then again. Emma stood in the doorway, hair unbrushed, holding a pan of biscuits she hadn't yet put in the oven. He held the letter out to her. She read it slow, lips moving, eyes tracing each line as if they might vanish if she blinked too fast. Her mouth trembled. Then she looked up, eyes full. "Does that mean I can't be taken?" He nodded. "And I get to stay?" "You were staying either way." She stepped forward and leaned into his chest, arms wrapping tight. It was the first time she'd hugged him without hesitation. He stood frozen for half a second, then closed his arms around her, careful and sure, like gathering up something too precious to name. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Later that day, they rode to the cottonwood tree that stood near the far edge of the land, the one where she'd freed that foal so many seasons ago. They brought with them 2 small stones. On one, he carved his name. On the other, hers. They buried them side by side at the foot of the tree, not as a grave, but as a marker of beginning. Emma pressed her hand to the earth after, palm flat, eyes closed. "You know," she said, voice barely a breath, "when you bought me, I thought I was going from one bad place to another. I didn't know people could be safe. I didn't know I still had anything left to give," he replied. They sat there until the light shifted gold, until the shadows stretched long and soft across the snow-covered ground. Then they rode home in silence, but not the kind that weighed heavy. This one was full of meaning, full of knowing. By the next spring, the farm bloomed brighter than it ever had. Emma planted flowers along the edge of the porch. The same wild ones that once grew without invitation now grew with intention. Her laughter rang more often. She asked about stars again, about seeds, about what made honey taste different when bees fed on clover. She called him Pa once, by accident, and when she saw his face soften, she started doing it more. And he didn't flinch. At night, they sat together by the fire, the old world behind them, the new one unfolding like pages not yet written. Sometimes he'd glance at her when she wasn't looking, braiding her hair, humming to the chickens, carving small animals that filled every shelf. He thought of that auction day. The dust, the sun, the rope around her wrist. He remembered the way she had looked up, not with hope, not with fear, but with a quiet defiance that said, "I will not disappear." And she hadn't. She had stayed. She had grown. She had changed everything. One evening, long after the fire burned low and the house fell to hush, Emma stood by the door, watching the last threads of sunlight weave through the trees. The widower joined her, leaning against the frame. "It's different now," she said. "What is?" "The light." He followed her gaze. It was the same sun. The same trees. But she was right. It glowed softer somehow. Fuller. Like it had found something worth touching. He looked at her, then nodded. "It is. Sometimes, the ones who come into your life aren't meant to stay for a reason or a season, but forever. Sometimes they arrive broken, bruised, too quiet to notice. Sometimes they change everything, just by standing still beside you." He didn't buy a servant that day. He bought a beginning. And by sunset, she had changed his life.